The moment happened without warning. No dramatic announcement, no formal inquiry, no press conference, just a royal garage, a quiet afternoon, and a 6-year-old boy crouching near a stack of old trunks pointing at something in the dark. That single moment is now sitting at the center of one of the most quietly explosive custody disputes the British royal family has faced in years. Because what Prince Louis noticed wedged behind those trunks wasn't a toy, it wasn't a forgotten bag. It was a dust-covered travel case bearing a royal crest, a crest connected to the late Queen Elizabeth II. And from that moment forward, nothing in that garage could be explained away. Prince William opened the space, Louis made the discovery, and the questions that came out of that room, they are still demanding answers. Stay with me, because this story has layers, and every single one of them matters. Setting the scene. To understand why this discovery hit so hard, you need to understand what Prince William was actually doing there in the first place. This was not a casual visit. This was not a family afternoon winding down with a stroll through the grounds. William had arrived with a specific purpose: to examine a locked storage space connected to Queen Camilla's private property after questions arose surrounding the location of certain royal items. The source of those questions has never been made entirely public, but what is known is that William arrived with members of the household, that the space in question had been described by Camilla's side as containing personal belongings, and that William, despite that explanation, pressed forward. That decision alone tells you something. When a future king walks into a room that someone powerful has already said contains nothing of significance, it is not because he is curious about old furniture. Now, before we go further, I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to think about this honestly. If you discovered something connected to Queen Elizabeth hidden inside a private room, something that wasn't supposed to be there, would you speak up immediately? Or would you stay quiet because of who the room belonged to? Drop a simple yes or no in the comments right now, because that one answer reveals exactly where you stand when loyalty and the truth suddenly pull in opposite directions. Back to the garage. When the door opened, the atmosphere changed almost immediately. William stood near the entrance. The household staff held their position several steps behind him. No one was reaching for anything. No one was speaking above a murmur. The kind of silence that settles in when everyone in the room understands that something is about to become very difficult to unsee. The initial expectation had been straightforward: paperwork, storage boxes, old personal effects, the kind of items that accumulate in any large private residence over the years. Maybe some old furnishings. Nothing unexpected, nothing that would change the direction of the day. But Prince Louis, young, unguarded, and completely unbothered by the tension filling the room, had moved slightly ahead of the adults, and he spotted it. Not on a shelf, not in plain view, not labeled and organized the way ordinary household storage tends to be. It was buried, a travel case, pushed deliberately behind a stack of older trunks, positioned close enough to the wall that only a narrow strip of its surface was even visible from the center of the room. A child, crouching at the right angle, could see it. An adult standing straight would have walked right past. Dust had gathered across the top. The corners showed wear from age. But one corner, the corner that Louis was now pointing toward, carried something that made dismissal impossible. A royal crest. William turned. He looked at the case. He did not speak for several seconds. Then he stepped forward, and everything that followed changed the entire shape of the investigation. The discovery examined. Let's be careful here, because this is exactly the kind of story where emotion can get ahead of evidence, and where you need someone to slow down and follow every detail methodically. The case was old. Anyone looking at it could see that immediately. The materials, the construction, the condition of the latches, all of it pointed to an object that had existed for a long time. What it did not point to was an object that had been sitting untouched since it first arrived in that garage. Here is the detail that changed everything for investigators. The dust pattern was wrong. When forensic attention is applied to a storage space, even informally, the way dust settles across surfaces tells a story. Undisturbed objects accumulate dust evenly. Objects that have been moved and replaced show a different pattern. The dust on the travel case did not match the dust on the surrounding trunks. That single observation reframed the entire question. It was no longer simply, how long has this case been here? It became, who put it here, and when? William reportedly ordered that nothing be touched. The case was to remain exactly where Louis had found it, exactly as Louis had found it, until its contents could be identified and its chain of custody established from the beginning. That instruction matters enormously, because it tells you that William wasn't treating this as a misplaced family keepsake or a clerical oversight. He was treating it as evidence. The room went quiet again. Investigators began examining the space around the case without moving it. Every trunk surrounding it was noted. Every label, or absence of a label, was recorded. Every visible detail of the case's exterior was documented. And then attention returned to the crest, not a decorative flourish, not a general royal emblem printed for commercial use. This crest carried a specific connection, one that linked the object not to the current reign, not to the present household, but to the late Queen Elizabeth II. At that moment, this stopped being a private property matter. An object with a documented connection to a former sovereign is not treated the same way as a box of personal photographs. Its presence in any location, and especially in a locked private garage, carries legal and historical implications that go far beyond household storage arrangements. William understood that immediately, and so did everyone else in the room. The paper trail begins. The case still hadn't been opened, but the investigation had already moved beyond its walls. While the physical object remained sealed and protected on site, investigators began pulling financial records connected to the movement and storage of items associated with the royal household during the relevant period. Now this is the part where the story shifts from dramatic to genuinely troubling. Royal households move possessions constantly. That is not a secret, and it is not suspicious on its own. Objects travel between residences for conservation, for security upgrades, for renovations, for exhibitions, for ceremonial preparation. Transport and storage fees are a routine line item in any large royal household's accounts. But the pattern matters. And the pattern here did not behave the way routine transport records are supposed to behave. The dates of certain payments appeared to cluster around periods when items connected to Queen Elizabeth's estate would have been expected to remain under tightly controlled custody. The payment descriptions were broad, unusually broad. The destinations were not always specified with the kind of clarity investigators expected from ordinary household logistics, and some references used language that suggested the items being moved were not ordinary. Here is why that distinction matters. A normal household chair gets moved by a normal removal company with a normal invoice. A historically significant textile, something tied to a former sovereign, something with provenance, something whose condition and location needs to be monitored, is handled differently. Specialized packaging, documented handover, temperature-controlled transportation in some cases, and a paper trail that should, at every stage, show exactly where that object went and who signed for it. The payments in question appeared to describe the kind of handling you would apply to something valuable. The problem was that the declared purpose of the garage was personal storage. Personal effects do not require specialized handling fees. Personal effects do not generate the kind of transport documentation that caught the investigators' attention. So here is the question that was now sitting at the center of the review. If this garage contained nothing but personal belongings, as had been stated, why were the financial records pointing towards something that required far more careful treatment than personal belongings typically demand? That question didn't have a comfortable answer, and the longer investigators looked at the invoices, the less comfortable it became. I need to pause here and ask you something, because this is the kind of story that forces you to decide where you stand before you hear the ending. If the financial records around a royal property told one story, and the official explanation told another, would you trust the records, or would you trust the explanation? Tell me in the comments, because the answer to that question is about to determine how you read everything that comes next. The case is opened. The decision to open the case did not happen immediately. William was deliberate about it. The chain of custody had to be established first, or at least enough of it to justify the examination. The last thing anyone wanted was to open the case under circumstances that could later be challenged or dismissed. But eventually, the moment came. The lock gave way. The lid was raised. The room went silent in a different way than it had before. Not the silence of caution, but the silence of people who were not prepared for what they were seeing. The first layer inside the case was protective fabric, archival quality material, the kind used specifically to separate delicate objects from direct contact with their containers during long-term storage. That detail alone was significant. You do not line a case with archival fabric if you are storing a winter coat. Beneath it, carefully folded, carefully positioned, carefully preserved, was a piece of crimson fabric. Not a curtain, not a decorative piece from a drawing room, ceremonial in weight, ceremonial in construction. Gold embroidery ran along one visible edge. The stitching was precise, the kind of workmanship that is not produced quickly and is not replicated cheaply. Investigators did not unfold it immediately. They examined the stitching first, then the lining, then the interior labels. Each detail could either confirm or complicate the emerging picture of what this object actually was and where it actually came from. Then the historical marking appeared, a connection clear, documented, unmistakable to the reign of Queen Elizabeth II. And at that point, the room did not simply go quiet. The atmosphere shifted completely, because now the question was no longer theoretical. There was a physically verified, historically connected, ceremonially significant object sitting inside a sealed case in a private garage that had been described as containing personal effects. Let that land for a moment. Not a rumor, not a suspicion, not speculation from outside the palace walls. A real object, with real markings, in a real location, and not one single piece of paperwork had been produced that explained, clearly and completely, how it came to be there. William reportedly looked at the object for a long time without speaking. Then the investigators found the second item inside the case, a document. It had been stored separately from the fabric, placed in its own protected section within the case, as though whoever had prepared this package had understood that the paper might ultimately matter as much as the object itself. The document carried dates, reference numbers, a description that appeared to correspond directly with the textile lying beside it. For the first time in the investigation, there was something more concrete than a suspicious pattern or a mismatched dust line. There was paperwork, and the paperwork pointed toward a transfer, the name that changed everything. A transfer document is not automatically proof of wrongdoing. Let's be completely clear about that. Royal property is transferred between custodians regularly. Objects move for conservation, for security, for exhibition loans, for ceremonial preparation. A document describing a transfer does not, by itself, establish that anything improper occurred. But the destination matters, the recipient matters, the authority behind the signature matters. And here is where the document inside that case transformed this story entirely. The name connected to the intended destination was Princess Catherine. Read that again slowly, because the implications run in every direction at once. If the transfer document was genuine, properly authorized, and accurately executed, then the presence of this heirloom in Camilla's storage might be explainable as part of a legitimate administrative process, something awaiting final handover, perhaps, or temporarily rerouted for a documented reason. But if the document was incomplete, improperly authorized, unsigned by the correct party, or indicative of a decision made without the required oversight, then the same piece of paper became something far more serious. It became evidence of a gap between what was intended and what had actually happened. William reportedly reviewed the document personally. His reaction, as described in accounts surrounding this controversy, was not rage. It was not accusation. It was the focused, deliberate response of a man who had just identified a contradiction that could not be dismissed. If Catherine was the intended recipient, why had the heirloom not reached her? If the transfer had been cancelled, where was the cancellation order? If the item had been temporarily rerouted, where was the authorization for that rerouting? And if none of those records existed, then who had made the decision to store this object here, and under whose authority? Every possible explanation required documentation, and none of that documentation was immediately available. That absence was not an answer, but it was, at this point, the most significant thing in the room. The investigation widens. What began as the search of a single garage was no longer a contained matter. William reportedly ordered a complete reconstruction of the chain of custody, not just for this object, but for the broader pattern of movements connected to the same period. The logic was straightforward. If one historically significant item could pass through an unclear chain of custody and end up in a private storage location without complete documentation, investigators had to ask whether the problem was isolated or whether other royal possessions had been handled the same way. That question changed the atmosphere completely. Investigators returned to the financial records with wider parameters. They were no longer looking for a single, unusual payment. They were looking for a pattern. And the records, examined across a longer timeline, appeared to show that the movement discovered in the garage was not necessarily a one-time event. There were references suggesting that the heirloom had passed through more than one storage point before reaching its discovered location. Each additional movement created another custody point, and each custody point was another person, another office, another handover that should have generated a record. Some of those records were present, some were not. The gaps between the records that existed and the gaps where records should have existed became the map the investigation was following. Now let me bring you directly into this for a moment. If you were Prince William and the records showed that a historically significant royal object intended for your wife had ended up in someone else's private storage with no clear explanation and no complete paper trail, what would you do? Because this is the decision that separated a private disagreement from something much larger. William could have accepted an administrative explanation and closed the matter quietly. Instead, he reportedly demanded that every relevant record be opened, all of them, examined fully, with nothing sealed behind the privacy of household administration. That demand immediately escalated the pressure on everyone around him. Camilla's representatives were said to be concerned that incomplete documents would be misread and that the privacy of household matters was not being respected. That argument has legitimate force. No responsible investigation draws conclusions from paperwork that hasn't been fully verified. But William's counter-argument was equally direct. You cannot verify records that remain sealed. You cannot reconcile an inventory if the relevant entries are withheld. You cannot establish the truth about a transfer document if the original authorization is unavailable. Verification requires access, and access was precisely what was being contested. The inventory arrives. The records eventually produced the one document investigators had been waiting for, the original inventory entry for the heirloom. It identified the object by reference number. It described its historical status. It specified where the item's custody was expected to remain. And beside that entry, matching the reference number exactly, was the transfer notation that had already been found inside the case. For the first time, two separate records were describing the same object. That was significant. It meant the transfer document was not an isolated piece of paper. It was part of an official process. It had been generated within the administrative framework governing royal property. But the inventory did not resolve the mystery. It sharpened it. Because while the transfer document appeared to describe an intended movement toward Catherine, the physical object had been discovered in storage linked to Camilla. And the inventory, which should have recorded where the object went after the transfer reference was created, contained a gap. Not a small gap, not a minor clerical omission that could be explained by bureaucratic backlog. A substantive absence of the kind of entry that should exist when a significant royal item moves from one documented custodian to another. Where was the receiving record? Where was the acknowledgement from the intended recipient? Where was the subsequent custody notation showing where the item went after the transfer instruction? None of it was there, and that absence inside an official inventory that should have captured precisely this kind of administrative detail was the most damaging single discovery of the entire investigation, because it meant the object had effectively disappeared from the official record between the transfer instruction and the garage. That is not an administrative error. That is a gap that demands an explanation. What this means for everyone involved. Let me be completely honest with you about what the evidence at this point does and does not establish. It does not prove that Queen Camilla personally removed, redirected, or improperly claimed a royal heirloom. A household as large and as administratively complex as a royal residence involves dozens of staff, multiple offices, and overlapping chains of authority. An item can move in a direction its most senior occupant never personally ordered. It does not prove that Princess Catherine was deliberately denied something intended for her. The transfer document may have reflected a preliminary intention rather than a completed instruction. Documents in royal households are sometimes created before their authorization is fully established, and it does not prove that the person who prepared the case, who lined it with archival fabric, who stored the document alongside the object, who ensured the textile was protected, had any malicious intent whatsoever. Careful preservation is not evidence of concealment. What the evidence does establish, according to the accounts surrounding this controversy, is this: an object with a documented connection to Queen Elizabeth II, a transfer instruction naming Princess Catherine as the intended recipient, a physical location connected to Camilla's private property where that object was found, a series of financial records reflecting movements that did not match the declared nature of the storage, an inventory entry showing the transfer reference was official, and a gap, a significant, undeniable gap between the transfer instruction and any record of what happened next. That combination is not gossip. It is not palace rumor dressed up in documentary language. It is a series of documented facts that, taken together, force a question that no one involved has yet answered in full. Why was the heirloom there? Louis's role and why it matters. There is one more dimension to this story that deserves its own space. Throughout this entire episode, the locked garage, the open case, the transfer document, the contested inventory, the widening investigation, there is one figure whose contribution is perhaps the most striking of all. Not William, not the investigators, not the administrative staff comparing dates and signatures. A 6-year-old boy. Louis did not arrive with a theory. He did not arrive with suspicion or with any understanding of what he was looking at. He arrived as a child arrives in any room, curious, unguarded, crouching at angles that adults do not crouch at, looking at spaces that adults tend to overlook. He was not searching for evidence. He was simply present. And because he was present, and because he noticed what everyone else had walked past, an entire chain of custody, one that may have remained undisturbed and unexamined for a long time, was suddenly pulled back into view. That detail is not a footnote to this story. It is one of its most important truths. The most significant discoveries are sometimes not made by the people with the most authority, the most expertise, or the most motivation to find something. They are made by the person who happens to be standing at the right angle, at the right moment, with no expectation of what they are supposed to see. Louis saw a strip of dusty leather with a royal crest on its corner. He pointed at it, and nothing about that room or the questions surrounding it has been simple since. The larger principle. Here is the reason this story extends beyond royal family drama. Here is why it matters to anyone watching from outside the palace walls, regardless of whether you follow the royal family closely or simply caught this because the headline stopped you. Royal families, like any institution holding historical objects, inherited property, or publicly significant assets, operate under a specific responsibility. Their possessions are photographed, catalogued, displayed, lent, inherited, and sometimes placed beyond public view. That is not inherently wrong. Some objects require protection. Some heirlooms need conservation. Some items belong in private custody while their authentication or restoration is completed. But all of that requires documentation. It requires a record that can be read, examined, verified, and if necessary, questioned. Without documentation, even an entirely innocent movement can become the center of controversy. An object moved for conservation becomes suspicious if the conservation record doesn't exist. A transfer made in good faith becomes contested when the authorization can't be produced. A storage decision made for practical reasons becomes impossible to defend if the reasoning was never written down. In this case, the most damaging element was not necessarily that the heirloom was in the garage. It was that the records could not cleanly explain why. The uncertainty that created the space between what the transfer document said and what the inventory showed is where suspicion lives. And suspicion, once it takes root in a gap that documentation should have closed, is extraordinarily difficult to remove. That is the lesson that emerges from this garage. Not that powerful people are inherently dishonest, not that royal households are inherently corrupt, but that even the most powerful institutions are only as trustworthy as the records they keep. And when those records fail, when the chain of custody breaks, when the inventory gaps appear, when the dates don't align, the vacuum fills with exactly the kind of controversy that surrounds this discovery. History does not belong to whoever currently holds the object. It belongs to the record that explains where that object came from, why it mattered, and how its custody was protected along the way. Prince William opened the garage because questions demanded answers. Louis pointed at something because children point at things that seem out of place. And the discovery that followed has now raised 4 questions that are still waiting for their final resolution. Why was the heirloom found there? Why did the transfer document name Catherine as its intended recipient? Why did the inventory fail to record what happened next? And who holds the authority to write the final chapter of that object's history? Those are not gossip questions. They are accountability questions. And they are not going to disappear simply because they are uncomfortable for the people closest to the answers. Before you go, one last question for you. Royal institutions have always operated with a certain level of privacy that the public is simply expected to accept. Do you think that age of royal privacy is ending? Or do you think powerful families will always find a way to keep their most sensitive questions behind closed doors? Tell me your answer in the comments, because the conversation happening beneath this video matters, and it keeps the story from quietly disappearing. If you believe hidden royal history should be examined rather than protected, then like this video right now, share it with someone who follows the royal family, and subscribe with notifications on, because the next story this channel covers goes deeper into the question of what else may have been moved and who had the authority to move it. Louis noticed something that changed a room. Attention can change the story that comes next. Don't look away.